The sky above Manhattan fractured at 3:17 in the morning. Not with sound, not with light, but with a wrongness that rippled through the fabric of existence itself. Reality buckled like wet paper pressed against glass, and in the space between heartbeats, the world became two things at once. Dr. Stephen Strange felt it first. He jolted upright in the sanctum sanctorum, the eye of Agamotto, burning cold against his chest. The sensation wasn't magical in nature, that was what disturbed him most. This was something fundamental, something that preceded magic itself. He reached out with his astral form and recoiled immediately. The metaphysical infrastructure of Earth 6116 was developing seams. Across the city, Reed Richards sat bolt upright in his laboratory, scattering data pads across the floor. The quantum sensors he'd installed after the last incursion event were screaming warnings in 17 different spectrums. But the readings made no sense. Space-time wasn't collapsing. It was multiplying, overlapping. He pulled up the mathematical models and felt his breath catch. The pattern looked less like a tear and more like a structural impossibility, as if reality itself had encountered a syntax error. By dawn, the overlaps had spread to 7 locations across North America. In Chicago, a street corner existed in 4 different states simultaneously. Traffic lights cycled through colors that had no names. Pedestrians walked through the intersection and emerged speaking languages they'd never learned. Wearing clothes they'd never owned, remembering childhoods that belonged to other versions of themselves. In Denver, gravity reversed itself inside a 3-block radius, but only for objects colored blue. Birds fell upward. The sky pressed down like a ceiling. Strange convened the emergency meeting in the sanctum's main chamber at 8 a.m. The room filled quickly. Reed Richards arrived first, hauling portable equipment and already sketching equations in the air with holographic projectors. Tony Stark came next, his armor's sensors struggling to map the dimensional fluctuations. Wanda Maximoff stood near the window, her scarlet energy crackling nervously around her fingertips. "It's not an incursion," Reed said without preamble, projecting a 3-dimensional model of the affected areas. Incursions are violent, destructive. 2 realities colliding until one ceases to exist. This is different. These realities aren't destroying each other, they're coexisting, simultaneously occupying the same space. "That's impossible," Tony said. "Clearly not." Reed manipulated the projection, zooming in on the Chicago overlap. "Look at this. The quantum probability matrix isn't collapsing into a single outcome. It's maintaining multiple states. All of them equally real." Strange stepped forward, his expression grim. "I've consulted the Vishanti. They confirm this isn't magical interference. Whatever's causing this exists outside the normal hierarchies of power." "Meaning what?" Wanda asked. "Meaning even the cosmic entities don't understand it." Strange's jaw tightened. "The Living Tribunal itself is observing, but not intervening." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. The Living Tribunal only stood aside when the threat exceeded its jurisdiction, when the problem existed on a level beyond even multiversal law. Tony's fingers flew across a holographic interface. "I'm reading 17 distinct overlap zones now." "No, wait, 21. They're spreading, not spreading." Reed corrected, his eyes fixed on the data streams. "Crystallizing, like frost patterns on glass. There's a logic to the formation, but it's not a logic I recognize." Strange moved to the window and stared out at the city. Even here, blocks away from the nearest overlap, he could feel it, a subtle vibration in the underlying code of existence. Reality was being rewritten 1 plank length at a time. "We need to see one up close," he said quietly. An hour later, they stood at the edge of the overlap zone above Avengers Tower. Strange had teleported them to the rooftop, where the distortion was most pronounced. The air itself looked fractured, as if space had been shattered into invisible shards and reassembled incorrectly. Reed extended a sensor probe into the affected area. The device existed for a moment in normal space, then began to flicker present and absent, solid and translucent here and somewhere else. Atomic cohesion is fluctuating. Reed reported, his voice steady, despite the impossibility he was witnessing. The strong nuclear forces varying between quantum states. This should cause immediate matter dissolution, but something's stabilizing it, holding all the contradictory states in superposition. Tony's armor sensors painted the overlap in thermal, electromagnetic, and gravitational spectrums. Each reading contradicted the others. It's like reality's grammar broke down. We're looking at a sentence that's simultaneously true and false. Strange extended his hand toward the distortion, mystical energy coiling around his fingers. The moment his spell touched the overlap's edge, it unraveled, not defeated, but translated into something else. The golden threads of Vishanti magic became blue, then transparent, then a color that hurt to perceive. "It's not resisting magic," Strange said slowly, withdrawing his hand. "It's recontextualizing it, changing the fundamental definitions." Wanda stepped forward, chaos energy swirling around her. "Let me try. Chaos magic doesn't follow normal rules." "No." Strange caught her wrist gently. "I don't think that will help. This isn't about power. It's about something more basic." He paused, searching for words. "It's like the universe's operating system is being rewritten while it's still running." Reed was already modeling the phenomenon, his mind racing through theoretical frameworks. "If I'm reading this correctly, the overlaps aren't random. They're appearing at points of high quantum uncertainty, places where reality was already thin, already prone to probability fluctuations." "So someone's exploiting weaknesses in space-time?" Tony asked. "No, someone's proving they exist." Reed's expression was troubled. "This is a demonstration, a proof of concept." The sky above them rippled again, and another layer of reality pressed itself against their own. For an instant, Strange saw another version of the tower, older, weathered, overgrown with vegetation. Then it was gone. Or perhaps it was still there, occupying the same space in a quantum state his eyes couldn't properly process. "We need to find the source," Wanda said. Strange nodded slowly, his mind already reaching out through the mystical currents, searching for the epicenter of the disturbance. But everywhere he looked, he found only more questions. More impossibilities made manifest. Somewhere in the fabric of the omniverse, something had arrived that didn't belong. Something that didn't obey the rules because it existed outside the framework where those rules applied, and it was just beginning to make itself known. The overlap above Central Park achieved full manifestation at 2 in the afternoon. The transformation occurred without warning. One moment the park existed in its normal state, and the next it had become a palimpsest of conflicting realities. Trees stood bare and lush simultaneously. The lake reflected summer sky and winter gray in the same surface. Joggers ran through grass that was green-brown and a color that existed somewhere between purple and the concept of absence. At the epicenter, where a Bethesda fountain fractured into 7 architectural variations, he appeared. Dr. Manhattan materialized, not through any portal or tear in space, but through a process that resembled reality, simply acknowledging what had always been there. One instant, the space contained only confused civilians and distorted matter. The next, a figure stood among them, blue-skinned and luminous, utterly naked and utterly still. He didn't announce himself, didn't move. His face held no expression beyond a distant curiosity, as if he were studying an equation that had caught his interest in passing. Strange felt the arrival like a shockwave through the mystic dimensions. He opened a gateway immediately, stepping through with Reed and Tony close behind. They emerged at the park's northern edge, where the overlap's boundary shimmered like heat haze. The moment Strange laid eyes on the blue figure, his breath stopped. This wasn't a cosmic entity in the traditional sense. The Vishanti emanated power, Galactus radiated hunger. Even Dormammu carried the weight of malevolent will. This being carried nothing. No emotion, no intent, no presence beyond pure existence. He was there the way a mathematical constant was there, undeniable, immutable, fundamentally true. "That's him," Strange whispered. "The source." Reed's sensors were already painting the air with data streams, each one more impossible than the last. His atomic structure, it's not stable. It's not unstable either. It's both. All possible quantum states existing in superposition, but without collapse. He looked up from his display, and for the first time, Strange saw genuine uncertainty in the scientist's eyes. He's maintaining coherent form while simultaneously existing as probability wave function. That shouldn't be possible. Tony's armor systems flickered, recalibrating frantically. Jarvis is having a hard time even classifying him as matter. Half my sensors say he's pure energy. The other half insist he's something else entirely. The blue figure turned his head slowly, regarding them with eyes that glowed like neutron stars. The movement was precise, mechanical almost, but underneath it, Strange sensed something vast, a consciousness processing information on scales he couldn't fathom. "I'm going to try making contact," Strange said. "Careful." Reed's warning carried unusual weight. We don't know what he's capable of. Strange stepped forward, crossing the overlap's threshold. The sensation was immediate and disorienting. His body existed in multiple states, his magic fractured across contradictory frameworks. He pushed through it, focusing his will, and approached the blue figure with hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I am Dr. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme of Earth. I speak for Sunit." The rejection wasn't violent. It simply was. The instant Strange came within 15 feet of the blue figure, reality itself intervened. Not an attack, not a defense, but a correction. Space-time reorganized around the figure in a perfect sphere, and anything attempting to enter that sphere found itself translated into a different set of conditions entirely. Strange's mystical energy, which could breach dimensional barriers and bind demons, encountered the field and became something else. The golden threads of Ashanti magic turned crystalline, then gaseous, then theoretical. He felt himself being redefined, his approach converted into a mathematical statement that was somehow both true and inadmissible. He staggered back, catching himself before he fell. The field hadn't pushed him, it had simply made his forward motion impossible by rewriting what forward meant within its radius. "Are you all right?" Reed was at his side, immediately scanning for injuries. Strange nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. "He didn't attack me. He didn't even acknowledge me. It's like..." He searched for words. "Like approaching a fundamental law of physics. You can't convince gravity to work differently. You can only exist within the parameters it sets." Tony's repulsors powered up instinctively. "So we can't reach him." "I don't think reach is the right word." Reed was staring at the blue figure with the intensity he usually reserved for breakthrough equations. "Look at how he's standing. Perfectly still. Not breathing, not shifting weight. He's not experiencing time the way we are." Indeed, the figure remained motionless at the overlap's center, his gaze now fixed on some point in the middle distance. Around him, the fractured realities continued their impossible dance. But he stood apart from them, a constant in a sea of variables. Strange gathered his power, preparing a different approach. "Perhaps if I..." The blue figure spoke. His voice was calm, measured, carrying no inflection whatsoever. Each word arrived with the weight of absolute certainty, as if he were reading from a script that had been written at the beginning of time. "This universe is not incorrect. It has simply exceeded its permitted bounds." The three of them froze. The voice resonated not through air, but through the fundamental substrate of reality itself. Strange heard it in English, but suspected it was being processed through something more basic than language direct transmission of conceptual information. Reed stepped forward cautiously, keeping just outside the sphere of influence. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The blue figure's eyes tracked to Reed with mechanical precision. There was no warmth in that gaze. No recognition of Reed as a person, only observation, data collection. "I am Dr. Manhattan. I observe conditions. I verify parameters." A pause that might have been calculation. "Your reality matrix has developed structural instabilities. The overlaps are symptoms of exceeded thresholds." "You're causing the overlaps," Tony demanded. "No." Manhattan's gaze shifted to encompass all three of them, simultaneously, an impossible feat that somehow seemed natural when he did it. "I am measuring them. Your universe is experiencing cascading probability failures. Multiple timelines attempting to occupy singular positions. It is attempting to exist in more states than its framework can support." Strange felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "You said permitted bounds. Permitted by whom?" The question contains a false assumption. Manhattan turned away from them, looking up at the fragmented sky where 7 different cloud patterns fought for dominance. Permission implies authority. There is no authority, only parameters, and your universe is violating them. Reed's mind was already racing ahead, analyzing implications. "If the overlaps are symptoms, what's the cause? What changed?" Manhattan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his tone held the same flat neutrality, but the words carried devastating weight. "Nothing changed. This has always been the trajectory. You simply reach the threshold where continuation becomes unsustainable." "Unsustainable." Strange's voice was sharp. "You're saying our universe is failing. I am saying your universe exists in a state that cannot persist indefinitely." Manhattan's hand rose, and at his touch, the air crystallized into visible mathematical formulas, equations so complex they hurt to perceive. "Every reality has a carrying capacity, a maximum complexity index. Earth 616 has exceeded its limit through recursive temporal manipulations, probability engines, reality alteration events. You have rewritten causality too many times. The structure is collapsing under its own contradictions." Tony's armor sensors were recording everything, though Jarvis reported a 97% corruption rate on the data. "And you're here to, what, fix it, destroy it?" "Neither." Manhattan lowered his hand, and the equations dissolved. "I am here to observe what happens when a universe exceeds its parameters. The process is already underway. My presence is incidental to the outcome." Strange felt ice in his veins. This being spoke of the potential death of their entire reality with the same detachment a scientist might note the temperature of a chemical reaction. No malice, no concern, just pure clinical observation. "There has to be a way to stabilize it," Reed said, desperation creeping into his voice despite his usual control. "If we can identify the exact nature of the instability, you cannot fix a theorem by arguing with its conclusion." Manhattan turned back to face them fully. "I have observed 17,463 universes reach this state. 12,809 collapsed entirely. 4,654 stabilized through external intervention. The remainder exist in permanent quantum uncertainty." The specificity was somehow more horrifying than vagueness would have been. Strange drew himself up, summoning authority from depths he rarely accessed. "We have faced extinction-level threats before. We've survived incursions, cosmic wars, reality rewrites. We will survive this." Manhattan regarded him with those emotionless eyes. "Your determination is noted. It will not alter the mathematical progression." He turned away again, his attention shifting to some calculation only he could perceive. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, had concluded. They might as well have been discussing the matter with a theorem written on a blackboard. Strange, Reed, and Tony stood at the edge of the overlap, watching the blue figure who held the potential destruction of everything they knew and loved, and found him utterly indifferent to that weight. Around them, Central Park continued its impossible transformation reality, folding in on itself like origami constructed from space-time itself. And at the center of it all, Dr. Manhattan stood perfectly still, observing, measuring, and waiting for a universe to discover whether it could solve an equation with no solution. Manhattan began his work at midnight. There was no announcement, no visible change in his behavior. He simply extended one hand toward the nearest overlap, and the impossible became systematized. Blue light traced outward from his fingertips in geometric patterns, not energy in any conventional sense, but something more fundamental. Pure information manifesting as visible structure. Where the light touched reality stopped arguing with itself. The overlaps didn't disappear. Instead, they crystallized into stable configurations, each contradictory state locked into perfect superposition. A building that was simultaneously glass and brick, and something crystalline ceased its flickering uncertainty and became all three at once, permanently. The contradiction resolved not through elimination, but through mathematical acceptance. Strange watched from the sanctum, his astral form hovering above the city. What he witnessed defied every principle of mystical law he'd spent decades mastering. Magic required will, intense sacrifice. This required nothing. Manhattan wasn't imposing order, he was redefining what order meant. By 3 a.m., 17 overlap zones had been converted into what Reed would later term stable paradoxes. Reality wounds that would never heal but would never worsen either. Fixed points of logical impossibility. The consequences manifested immediately. In Brooklyn, gravity reversed itself within a 12-block radius. Not suddenly, not violently, but with perfect precision. Objects didn't fall upward in chaos, they rose with exact symmetry to their previous descent. Water fountains became pillars reaching toward the ground sky. Birds flew downward through air that had become floor instead of ceiling. The residents screamed, clutching at lampposts that now hung from the earth above their heads. But no one died. The reversal was too perfectly calculated for casualties. Manhattan stood at the epicenter observing. His hand moved in minute adjustments, and the gravitational constant shifted by increments measured in Planck units. Not random, methodical. In Midtown, atomic valences began cycling through impossible values. Carbon became carbon-14, then carbon-12, then something with 7 protons that shouldn't exist, but did anyway. The changes rippled outward in spherical waves, transmuting matter according to principles that had never applied to Earth 6 scenes before. A hot dog cart dissolved into constituent molecules, then reformed as a sculpture of compressed light. The vendor stared at his hands, which had become briefly transparent, before resolving back into flesh that was 93% certain it was flesh. Tony Stark stood in his workshop, surrounded by weapons that no longer understood what they were. The repulsor technology in his armor had been based on arc reactor physics that assumed a consistent relationship between energy and mass. That relationship was now negotiable. He aimed his palm at a test target and fired. The repulsor blast emerged, traveled 3 feet, then stopped and asked itself what forward meant in a space where vectors had become suggestions. The energy hung in midair, cycling through colors that included magnetic north and Samnasian, the concept of Tuesday. "Jarvis," Tony said, his voice tight. "Tell me you're getting this." "Sir, my diagnostic systems are reporting that reality is operating at 47% efficiency. However, they also report that this percentage is meaningless because mathematics itself has become contextual within the affected zones." Tony's jaw clenched. He'd built his entire life on the principle that problems had solutions, that engineering could overcome impossibility. But you couldn't engineer around a rewritten rulebook. The Avengers assembled at dawn, in a command center that kept trying to exist in 3 different layouts simultaneously. The chairs were solid liquid, in a state that felt like sitting on probability itself. Captain America stood at the head of the table, his expression carved from granite. Steve Rogers had fought Nazis, aliens, and gods. He'd watched his world end and been reborn into a future he barely recognized. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy. It was a condition. Stark, what are we dealing with? Tony pulled up holographic displays that flickered between showing data and showing the concept of data. He's not attacking. He's recalibrating. Every overlap zone he touches becomes a laboratory for testing alternate physical laws. Gravity inversion here, atomic restructuring there, dimensional folding in Queens. Can we stop him? Natasha Romanoff's voice was level professional, but her eyes betrayed calculation. She was already running scenarios looking for weaknesses. Stop a mathematical proof. Reed Richards entered the room, his face haggard from 18 hours without sleep. He's not doing anything we can interrupt. He's demonstrating what happens when you remove the axioms that reality is built on. Thor's hand tightened on Mjolnir. Then we destroy him before he unmakes all of Midgard. With what? Bruce Banner spoke quietly from the corner, his eyes holding the green tint that meant the Hulk was close to the surface. I've run the numbers. His atomic structure is stable across all quantum states simultaneously. You can't smash something that exists as pure mathematics. Wanda Maximoff's fingers crackled with scarlet energy. My power can rewrite reality. You rewrite probabilities, Reed interrupted gently. He exists outside probability. Your chaos magic assumes there's a reality to alter. He's operating at a level beneath that assumption. The room fell silent. Heroes who'd faced extinction a dozen times over sat paralyzed by the realization that their power was fundamentally insufficient. Strange materialized in the center of the room, his astral form coalescing into physical presence. His expression carried news that none of them wanted to hear. I've consulted with the Vishanti, reached out to every mystical entity within my access. They all say the same thing. He paused, the weight of cosmic authority heavy in his voice. Manhattan isn't violating any laws. He's revealing laws we didn't know existed. Laws that supersede everything we thought was fundamental. There has to be a way to fight back, Steve said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of necessity. There is. Strange's eyes held terrible knowledge. But it would require us to operate on his level. To stop thinking in terms of power and start thinking in terms of logical proof. Meaning what exactly? Natasha asked. Reed stepped forward, pulling up equations that hurt to read. Meaning we don't fight him. We solve him. Treat this like a problem with a mathematical solution rather than an enemy to be defeated. Tony stared at the equations, his genius mind already racing ahead. You're talking about finding a logical framework that can coexist with his framework. Proving that Earth 616 can exist within acceptable parameters. Exactly. Reed's expression was grim. But to do that, we need to understand what those parameters are. And the only one who knows is him. In Central Park, Manhattan stood amid a zone where space itself had become nonlinear. The fountain existed at every point along its possible trajectory simultaneously, a solid object that was also a quantum probability cloud. Water fell upward, downward, and in directions that had no names in Euclidean geometry. He raised both hands, and the air between them filled with structures visible only to those who could perceive beyond 3 dimensions. Lattices of pure logic, frameworks of causality, the skeletal architecture underlying reality itself. To anyone watching with normal sight, he appeared to be conducting an invisible orchestra. To Reed's scanners operating at the absolute edge of their theoretical capacity, he was rewriting the fundamental constants of the universe. Not all at once, not destructively, but with the patience of mathematics itself, testing each axiom, each assumption, each rule that Earth 616 had operated under since its inception. The strong nuclear force weakened in a perfect sphere, then strengthened beyond normal tolerances. Electrons jumped orbital shells in patterns that spelled out theorems in a language humans hadn't invented yet. The speed of light became variable, slowing to a crawl in one zone while achieving infinity in another. And through it all, Manhattan's expression never changed. No satisfaction, no curiosity, no recognition that he was potentially destroying a universe that contained 8 billion individual lives, each with hopes and fears and people they loved. He was simply measuring, recording, observing what happened when you removed the safety rails from existence. Strange appeared at the edge of the zone, maintaining a careful distance. You're changing the fundamental constants. If you continue, this universe will become uninhabitable. Manhattan turned his head with mechanical precision. Habitability is not a universal requirement. It is a local preference. For the beings who live here, it's everything. Yes. Manhattan returned his attention to his work. Your perspective is noted. It remains irrelevant to the underlying mathematics. Strange felt something he rarely experienced: true helplessness. He could bargain with demons, bind cosmic entities, navigate the political hierarchies of 1,000 mystical dimensions. But you couldn't negotiate with a calculator. What will it take for you to stop? Strange asked, knowing the question was futile but unable to remain silent. Manhattan paused. For a moment he seemed to consider the question with actual thought rather than automatic response. Evidence, he said finally, that this universe can exist within sustainable parameters, a proof that the contradictions can be resolved without cascading failure. He looked directly at Strange, and for the first time something almost like interest flickered in those inhuman eyes. Can you provide that proof? Strange met his gaze and answered with the only truth available. I don't know. Then the measurement continues. Manhattan returned to his work, and Strange retreated, carrying the weight of a universe's survival, back to those who might be capable of bearing it. Behind him, Central Park had become a monument to impossible geometry. Trees that were simultaneously oak and ash and crystallized time. Grass that grew downward into earth that had forgotten how to be solid. A sky that contained every sunset and sunrise. Earth 616 had ever witnessed all occurring at once. And at the center of it all, a blue figure conducting an experiment that would determine whether reality itself could pass a test it had never studied for. The Living Tribunal arrived without fanfare, which was itself a statement. When cosmic entities of his magnitude manifested, reality typically announced their presence through gravitational echoes, dimensional tremors, or the sudden awareness among lesser beings that something vastly beyond their comprehension had turned its attention toward them. The tribunal simply appeared standing in the space above Manhattan, as if he had always been there, and observers had only now noticed. He towered 300 feet tall, his golden form radiant with the authority of the omniverse itself. 3 faces regarded the universe simultaneously: equity, necessity, and vengeance, each representing a pillar of cosmic law. Where he stood, the fractured realities of Central Park stabilized momentarily, not from his power but from the weight of his presence. Even chaos recognized hierarchy. Dr. Manhattan looked up from his work. His expression didn't change, but he stopped moving. For the first time since arriving in Earth 616, he gave something his complete attention. The tribunal's voice resonated across every dimensional frequency, a sound that was simultaneously thunder and mathematics, judgment and equation. You operate beyond jurisdiction. Explain yourself. Manhattan studied the tribunal with the same clinical detachment he'd applied to everything else. His gaze moved from face to face, measuring, categorizing, finding each one equal to the others in perfect cosmic balance. I require no explanation. I am observation manifest. You alter fundamental constants. The face of necessity spoke now, its tone carrying the weight of inevitability. Such action falls within my purview. You have not requested permission from the cosmic order. Permission is a concept that assumes authority. Authority is a concept that assumes hierarchy. Manhattan's hand gestured toward the impossible geometry of the park around them. I recognize no hierarchy, only conditions and their logical consequences. The tribunal's three faces flickered with something that might have been surprise, though cosmic entities rarely experienced emotions recognizable to mortal observers. In his existence spanning countless realities, few beings had ever simply rejected his authority rather than challenging it. Strange watched from the sanctum, his astral form invisible to normal perception, but acutely aware of what he was witnessing. This wasn't a battle. It was a philosophical collision between two entities operating on fundamentally incompatible frameworks. The face of equity spoke, its voice carrying perfect balance. This universe exists under laws established by the one above all. You threaten those laws. Threaten. I threaten nothing. Manhattan's tone remained flat, emotionless. I observe that this universe has exceeded its sustainable parameters. The laws you reference were designed for a different configuration. They no longer apply. The laws are eternal. Nothing is eternal. Even eternity is a duration subject to mathematical limits. The tribunal's golden aura brightened reality, warping around him as he prepared to exercise judgment. The face of vengeance now spoke, its voice carrying the weight of cosmic retribution. You claim authority over existence itself. This cannot be permitted. Manhattan tilted his head slightly, the gesture almost curious. I claim no authority. I am merely accurate. If my accuracy conflicts with your laws, then your laws are insufficient. The tribunal raised one massive hand, and the fabric of space-time bent to his will. Cosmic judgment manifested as pure, undeniable decree, the kind of absolute power that had unmade entities who thought themselves gods, that had rewritten entire timelines with a gesture. The judgment descended upon Manhattan like a mountain of compressed inevitability, and stopped. Not because Manhattan blocked it, not because he resisted, but because the moment the tribunal's judgment touched him, it encountered something it had never experienced before. A being who existed as pure logic, without interpretation, layer, without the conceptual framework that cosmic law required to function. The judgment tried to find purchase to define Manhattan as guilty or innocent, compliant or defiant. Instead, it found only equations, pure mathematical truth with no morality, no intent, no purpose beyond accuracy. The tribunal's three faces showed something unprecedented confusion. Manhattan observed the faltering judgment with clinical interest. You attempt to impose verdict upon observation. Verdict requires subjectivity. I am objective. Your judgment has no target. Impossible. The word came from all three faces simultaneously. All things exist within the framework of cosmic law. Your framework assumes all things possess qualities subject to judgment, will intent choice. I possess none of these. I am a constant. You cannot judge a constant any more than you can find a circle guilty of being round. Strange felt his breath catch. Manhattan wasn't fighting the tribunal. He was demonstrating that the fight was categorically impossible. Like trying to punch a number or arrest the concept of Tuesday. The tribunal's form flickered something that had never occurred in the recorded history of the omniverse. His judgment, unable to resolve Manhattan into any category it understood, began to cascade through alternate interpretations. Was Manhattan a threat, yes and no, simultaneously? Did he violate cosmic law? The question became meaningless when the subject existed outside the framework where law applied. Should he be removed from reality? Removal required categorizing him as something separable from reality. But his existence was so fundamentally woven into logical truth that removing him would be like removing the number 3 from mathematics. You are redefining my purpose, the tribunal said, and for the first time in existence, his voice carried uncertainty. No, Manhattan corrected. I am revealing that your purpose was always subject to specific conditions. Those conditions have changed. Therefore, your purpose must be recalculated. The three faces turned inward, consulting with each other in communication beyond sound or light. Strange could feel the cosmic hierarchy trembling. The Living Tribunal was the omniverse's supreme arbiter, the final word on multiversal law. If he couldn't categorize, Manhattan couldn't judge him, couldn't even properly perceive him within the framework of cosmic order. The implications were staggering. Reed Richards burst into the command center where the Avengers still monitored the situation, his face pale with realization. He's not just challenging the Tribunal's authority, Reed said, pulling up sensor data that looked more like abstract art than scientific measurement. He's proving that authority itself is contextual, that even cosmic law is just another framework, and frameworks can be obsolete. What does that mean for us? Steve asked. Reed's hands shook as he manipulated the holographic displays. It means we've been operating under an assumption that turned out to be wrong. We thought the cosmic hierarchy was absolute, the one above all, at the top, the tribunal below. That then the abstract entities, then us. But Manhattan exists outside that hierarchy. He's not above it or below it. He's orthogonal to it, a completely separate axis of existence. Tony stared at the readings, his genius mind already extrapolating the horrifying conclusion. And if he can exist outside it, then so can other things, Bruce finished quietly. The hierarchy isn't a law of nature. It's just the system we've been using, and systems can be replaced. In Central Park, the tribunal's form had begun to phase between states. His three faces multiplied, then reduced, then became a single face, then three again. He was attempting to recalculate his own nature in light of what Manhattan represented. I am the Living Tribunal, he said. But now it sounded like a question rather than a declaration. I maintain balance across all realities. You maintain balance within a specific framework. Manhattan corrected. That framework assumes certain axioms. I am demonstrating that those axioms are not universal. Then what remains? The face of equity asked, and the question carried the weight of genuine confusion. If the cosmic laws can be superseded, what governs existence? Manhattan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his words carried the finality of mathematical proof. Nothing governs existence. Existence simply is. Governance is a concept you impose to make the incomprehensible manageable. But I am not manageable. I am merely true. The tribunal stood motionless, his vast consciousness processing implications that would take lesser minds millennia to contemplate. Around them, the overlap zones continued their impossible configurations, each one a monument to the idea that reality was far less stable than anyone had believed. Finally, the tribunal spoke, and his voice carried something that might have been acceptance or might have been defeat. I cannot judge what I cannot categorize. I cannot categorize what exists beyond framework. You are... He paused, searching for terminology that had never been needed before. You are a null case, not permitted, not forbidden. Simply external. Accurate, Manhattan confirmed. The tribunal's form began to fade, not in retreat, but in withdrawal. He was removing himself from a situation that fell outside his constitutional ability to address. Before he vanished entirely, his final words echoed across dimensions. The one above all will take notice. What occurs then is beyond my authority to predict. And then he was gone, leaving only the faint impression of his presence and the revolutionary understanding that the cosmic order itself had just admitted inadequacy. Manhattan returned to his work immediately, as if the entire exchange had been a minor interruption rather than a fundamental reshaping of multiversal understanding. Strange materialized beside Reed in the command center, his face grave. The Living Tribunal withdrew, he said, and the words felt like announcing the death of gravity. The supreme cosmic authority of the omniverse just admitted he can't handle this situation. The room fell into stunned silence. "So what now?" Natasha asked, her voice carrying the practical focus of someone trained to find solutions, even in impossible scenarios. Strange looked at each of them in turn, these heroes who had saved the world 1,000 times and spoke the truth they all dreaded. "Now we're on our own. Truly on our own. If Manhattan's experiments destroy Earth 616, there's no higher power coming to save us. We have to save ourselves." "How?" Steve's question was simple, direct, and almost certainly unanswerable. Strange looked toward the window, toward Central Park, where a blue figure was calmly dismantling the foundations of reality itself. "We prove him wrong," Strange said. "We demonstrate that this universe can exist within sustainable parameters. We solve the equation he says has no solution." "And if we can't?" Tony asked. Strange's expression held the weight of cosmic awareness. "Then we discover what happens when a universe fails its final exam." Outside Manhattan raised both hands, and the laws of thermodynamics inverted within a perfect sphere. Heat flowed from cold to hot. Entropy decreased. Time's arrow reversed its direction, and somewhere beyond the reach of cosmic law, beyond the jurisdiction of even the tribunal himself, something vast and incomprehensible took notice of the anomaly occurring in Earth 616. The equation was becoming more complex, the test was getting harder, and the margin for error had just dropped to zero. Galactus arrived at the edge of the solar system 3 hours after the tribunal's withdrawal, and his hunger preceded him like a wave of existential dread. The devourer of worlds stood against the backdrop of infinite stars, his form towering miles high, his presence so vast that planets trembled in their orbits. He had consumed countless civilizations, ended billions of lives with the same indifference a human might feel swatting a mosquito. He was hunger incarnate, a fundamental force of the cosmos, given consciousness and terrible purpose. He felt the disturbance in Earth 616's reality matrix like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonic symphony. The overlaps, the rewritten physics, the impossible geometries, they called to him not as food, but as aberration. Something was introducing variables into the cosmic equation that shouldn't exist. More troubling something was making him question what hunger meant. Silver Surfer materialized in the Avengers Command Center, his chrome skin reflecting emergency lighting in sharp angles. His normally calm demeanor had cracked, revealing genuine fear beneath. "Galactus comes," he said without preamble, "but not to feed. He's disturbed by the anomalies. He believes they threaten the cosmic balance he maintains through consumption." Reed looked up from the calculations that had consumed him for the past 6 hours. "Can he stop Manhattan? I don't know." The surfer's voice carried uncertainty he rarely allowed himself. "My master has ended civilizations, consumed the life force of entire star systems. But this..." He gestured toward the holographic displays showing Manhattan's expanding sphere of influence. "This is something beyond even his understanding." In Central Park, Manhattan had expanded his experimental field to encompass 17 city blocks. Within that space, the fundamental forces operated on principles that had never applied to Earth 616 before. Strong nuclear force varied by location. Electromagnetic fields propagated in spirals. Causality became negotiable. He sensed Galactus's approach the same way a mathematician might notice an error in a proof. Not with alarm, but with mild interest. Another variable entering the equation. Galactus descended through Earth's atmosphere, his passage tearing holes in the sky that sealed themselves with reluctance. He landed 3 miles from Manhattan's position, and the impact registered on seismographs worldwide. The cosmic entity regarded the blue figure with eyes that had witnessed the birth of galaxies. When he spoke, his voice resonated through every dimension simultaneously. "You alter the fundamental substrate of reality. This falls within my purview as cosmic balance keeper. Cease your activities." Manhattan turned to face him. And for the first time since arriving, Something like recognition flickered across his features. Not of Galactus specifically, but of pattern. Another entity operating on cosmic scale, another manifestation of universal principle. You maintain balance through consumption, Manhattan observed. An elegant solution to entropy management, but inefficient. Galactus's eyes blazed with power that could atomize planets. I am eternal. I am inevitable. I am unnecessary. Manhattan interrupted. Within the framework this reality currently occupies, yes, you serve a function. But frameworks change. I am demonstrating that consumption is not the only method of cosmic regulation. The Devourer's form swelled with rage that was simultaneously personal and cosmically detached. He had been challenged before, fought before, even defeated on rare occasions, but never dismissed, never classified as obsolete. He raised one hand, and reality-warping energy gathered at his fingertips, power sufficient to unmake solar systems, to rewrite the laws of physics across light years, to impose his will upon the fundamental forces themselves. The energy lanced toward Manhattan with the inevitability of a collapsing star, and stopped, not blocked, not deflected, but translated. The moment Galactus's power entered Manhattan's sphere of influence, it encountered a logical framework that redefined what power meant. The cosmic energy found itself classified as a specific type of particle interaction, one governed by rules that made directed assault a categorical impossibility. Galactus poured more energy into the attack, enough to crack a planet's crust. Manhattan stood unchanged, observing the phenomenon with clinical detachment. You operate under the assumption that force can override logic, Manhattan said. This is incorrect. Force is subject to logic. I am logic. Therefore, your force is subject to me. In that moment, Galactus experienced something he had not felt in eons, his hunger-changing nature. Not increasing or decreasing, but transforming into something alien. He felt hungry for concepts, for understanding, for variables that didn't have solutions. It was disturbing in ways that transcended fear. The Phoenix Force arrived next, manifesting in low orbit as a raptor of pure cosmic flame that stretched across thousands of miles. Where it passed the fabric of space-time, rejuvenated death, giving way to rebirth in an eternal cycle that had persisted since the universe's inception. Jean Grey rode at the Phoenix's heart, her consciousness merged with the primordial force of life and death. Through the Phoenix's cosmic awareness, she perceived Manhattan not as a being, but as an equation that refused to balance. The Phoenix descended, wreathing Earth in flames that didn't burn, but rather represented the concept of transformation itself. It circled Manhattan's position, probing, analyzing, searching for the pattern it could use to impose the cycle of death and rebirth. It found nothing. Manhattan existed outside the cycle. He had no life to end, no death to transform, no rebirth to anticipate. He was static, unchanging, a constant in a universe built on variables. Jean spoke with the Phoenix's voice, her words carrying the weight of cosmic inevitability. All things must die. All things must be reborn. This is the fundamental law, a law applicable to biological systems and entropy-driven processes. Manhattan responded, I am neither. Your law does not apply. The Phoenix screamed not in rage, but in confusion. For the first time since its existence began, it encountered something that couldn't be integrated into the cycle. Something that stood outside life and death entirely. It tried to impose transformation anyway, wrapping Manhattan in flames that had rekindled dying stars. The fire touched him, recognized him, and extinguished itself. Not defeated, but irrelevant. Jean felt the Phoenix's confusion bleeding into her own consciousness. What are you? She whispered. Observation, Manhattan replied. You cannot kill observation. You cannot birth it. It simply exists, or it doesn't. The Celestials arrived, last three of them manifesting simultaneously in Earth's orbit. The Searcher, the analyzer, the judge towering miles high. Ancient beyond mortal comprehension, architects of evolutionary design across countless worlds. They had seeded life on Earth. Billions of years ago, had returned periodically to assess their experiment, had judged civilizations worthy or wanting. They operated on timescales that made empires into footnotes. They detected Manhattan's alterations to Earth 666's fundamental structure and found it wrong. Not morally, but mathematically. The seed patterns they had planted in humanity's genetic code were being recontextualized by Manhattan's presence. Evolutionary pathways they had calculated with precision were branching into impossible directions. The judge raised one massive hand, and reality-warping judgment descended the same force that had once deemed entire planetary populations failures and unmade them with absolute authority. The judgment reached Manhattan and encountered the same problem the Living Tribunal had faced. It tried to categorize him as success or failure, worthy or unworthy, acceptable or aberrant. Instead, it found only pure data, neutral and unjudgeable. The Celestials conferred among themselves in communication that transcended language. Their conclusion rippled across dimensional frequencies. Manhattan represented a null result. Not a failure of their experiment, but something completely external to it. Like discovering a variable in an equation that shouldn't have variables. Reed watched all of this through sensors that were barely functional. His mind racing to process implications that rewrote cosmic hierarchy. "They're not fighting him," he said, voice tight with realization. "They can't fight him. He's demonstrating that all of them, Galactus, Phoenix, the Celestials, are just different implementations of the same basic framework. And he exists outside that framework." Strange stood beside him. Astral awareness stretched to its limit. "It's worse than that. He's showing them that their purposes are contingent. Galactus maintains balance through hunger, but only because the current universal framework requires it. Phoenix maintains the life-death cycle, but only because entropy currently works a certain way. The Celestials seed evolution, but only because causality currently progresses linearly. And if Manhattan changes those conditions... Tony didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. In Central Park, surrounded by the greatest cosmic powers in the universe, Manhattan continued his work. Galactus's hunger transformed into confused yearning. The Phoenix's flames guttered uncertainly, unable to find purchase on something that wasn't alive. The Celestials' judgment protocols ran in endless loops, unable to compute a verdict. None of them attacked directly again. They simply observed these cosmic entities who had shaped reality for eons, watching a blue figure prove that their authority was based on assumptions that could be revoked. Manhattan raised both hands, and the space between them filled with structures visible only to cosmic perception. Frameworks of pure causality, lattices of logical progression, the bare architecture of how one thing led to another. Then, with movements precise as a surgeon's, he began removing axioms. The speed of light became variable, not constant. Cause and effect separated, allowing effects to precede their causes. Entropy reversed in localized pockets, then randomized, then followed patterns that had no names in any language. Galactus felt his hunger distort, becoming hunger for the past and the future simultaneously. The Phoenix's flames burned in reverse, consuming rebirth and generating death. The Celestials' evolutionary calculations shattered into probabilities that summed to more than 100%. And through it all, Manhattan's expression never changed. No triumph, no satisfaction, no recognition that he was fundamentally undermining the cosmic order that had persisted since the universe's birth. He was simply testing, recording, observing what happened when you removed the foundational assumptions of existence. Silver Surfer's chrome form dimmed his cosmic awareness, overwhelmed. My master is changing. His purpose is being redefined. I can feel it through our bond. He's becoming something else. Something that doesn't know what it hungers for anymore. They're all changing, Wanda said softly, her reality warping senses, picking up distortions that normal perception couldn't grasp. Manhattan isn't attacking them. He's just existing in a way that makes their existence paradoxical. Strange's expression was grim. And if he continues, if he keeps removing axioms, keeps rewriting the base conditions of reality, then everything built on those conditions collapses, Reed finished. Not destroyed, just rendered invalid. Like trying to run software on hardware that no longer recognizes the programming language. In orbit, the cosmic entities hung in space, unable to intervene. Unable to retreat, trapped by the simple fact that Manhattan's presence challenged the very foundations of what they were. And on Earth, in a park that had become a monument to impossible mathematics, a blue figure worked with patient precision toward conclusions that would determine whether a universe could survive becoming something it had never been prepared to be. The battlefield held no explosions, no energy blasts, no dramatic confrontations. Only the quiet, terrible sound of reality, discovering that the rules it had always followed were optional. And optional rules, it turned out, were far more terrifying than any cosmic enemy could ever be. The war room beneath Avengers Tower had become a temple of desperate genius. Every available surface was covered with equations. Mystical diagrams, holographic projections, and notes scrawled in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as exhaustion set in. Reed Richards stood at the center, surrounded by the greatest minds Earth 616 had to offer. Tony Stark, to his left armor, discarded in favor of direct neural interface with his computational systems. Doctor Strange, to his right, mystic energy flowing through ritual configurations that bent space-time into observable shapes. Hank Pym monitored quantum fluctuations. Bruce Banner ran probability matrices. Shuri of Wakanda contributed insights from vibranium's unique relationship with physics. They had been working for 16 hours straight. "We can't fight him," Reed said, for perhaps the 20th time. But now the statement carried weight of proven theorem rather than hypothesis. But we can potentially create a counter-framework, something that doesn't oppose his logic, but rather coexists with it. Tony pulled up a three-dimensional model that hurt to look at directly. I've been analyzing his pattern. Every time he modifies a fundamental constant, he's not randomizing it. He's testing specific parameters. Like he's searching for the breaking point. Or the balance point, Strange interjected. His eyes glowed with borrowed power from entities willing to lend their strength even if they couldn't directly intervene. What if we demonstrate that Earth 616 can exist within stable parameters? Give him the proof he said he needed. Reed's expression showed cautious hope. It would require us to model the entire universe as a logical system. Identify every contradiction, every probability excess, every point where we've bent causality past sustainable limits. Can we even do that? Bruce asked quietly. We have to try. Reed began sketching with light itself, creating formulae that incorporated science magic and pure mathematics. Strange, you said the Vishanti mentioned sustainable thresholds. What exactly did they mean? Strange stepped forward, weaving mystical symbols into Reed's scientific framework. Every reality has a complexity budget. Think of it as how many impossible things can happen before the universe runs out of ability to reconcile them. Earth 616 has experienced countless reality warps, time manipulations, probability alterations. We've exceeded our budget. So we need to reduce complexity. Shuri said, her fingers flying across Wakandan computational interfaces. But without destroying what makes this universe what it is. Tony shook his head. That's the paradox. The things that make Earth 616 unique, the Infinity Stones, the Phoenix Force, Scarlet Witch's reality manipulation, those are exactly what pushed us over the limit. We'd have to unmake our own power to save ourselves. not unmake. Reed corrected his mind, already racing ahead. Restructure. Find a configuration where all those elements can coexist without creating cascading contradictions. Wanda Maximoff entered the room, her presence announced by ripples in local probability. You want to rewrite reality again? Isn't that what got us here? Not rewrite, Strange said gently. Optimize, like cleaning up code without changing the program's function. Reed pulled up sensor data from Manhattan's experimental zones. Look at this. When he modifies the strong nuclear force, he doesn't just randomize it. He's testing whether alternate values can support stable matter. When he inverts entropy, he's checking if order can persist without the second law of thermodynamics. He's debugging the universe, Tony said, sudden realization flooding his voice. He's not trying to destroy Earth 616. He's trying to find a version of it that works. Then we help him, Reed said firmly. We show him what a stable Earth 616 looks like. We create a counter model. The work began in earnest. Strange established a mystical framework, drawing on knowledge from the Vishanti, the Book of the Vishanti, and forbidden texts that carried prices he'd pay later. The framework created a pocket dimension, small, unstable, but isolated enough to test theories without risking the broader universe. Reed built the mathematical foundation equations that described reality as a self-consistent, logical system. Every law of physics, every quantum interaction, every causal relationship mapped with precision that would have taken normal computers millennia to calculate. Tony provided the computational power Jarvis and his successor AIs working in parallel across thousands of processing cores. The data flow was so intense that cooling systems throughout the tower ran at maximum capacity. Hank Pym contributed understanding of subatomic structure. Bruce added insights from gamma radiation's unique relationship with probability. Shuri integrated vibranium-based stabilization matrices. And Wanda held it all together. Her chaos magic, the same power that had once rewritten the universe with 3 words, now served a different purpose. She didn't alter reality. She prevented it from collapsing under the weight of their experiment. Every time the pocket dimension threatened to implode from internal contradiction, her power smoothed the edges, found the balance points, kept the simulation running. Hours passed. The pocket dimension grew more complex, incorporating more variables, testing more configurations. We're close, Reed muttered, his eyes bloodshot but focused. If we can just balance the Infinity Stone's probability warping with the Celestial's evolutionary parameters, compensate for temporal manipulations with entropy adjustments. The simulation crashed for the 47th time. Tony slammed his fist on the console. Every configuration leads to cascade failure. We fix one problem, create 3 more. It's like trying to solve the equation where the variables keep changing. Because we're thinking too small, a young voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Franklin Richards stood there, his eyes glowing with power that made even Strange uncomfortable. The boy who could create pocket universes, who had power that rivaled cosmic entities who represented Earth 616's greatest triumph and potentially its greatest liability. Franklin, Reed began, paternal concern warring with desperate hope. You shouldn't be. I can help, Dad. Franklin walked forward, and reality bent slightly around him, accommodating his presence the way water flows around a stone. You're trying to model the universe from inside it. That's why it keeps failing. Reed stared at his son. What do you mean? Franklin raised one hand, and between his fingers, a miniature universe bloomed. Perfect, complete, operating on laws that were simultaneously familiar and alien. I've been practicing, Franklin said quietly, ever since I realized that my power is part of the problem. Every pocket universe I create adds to the complexity budget. I've been trying to create ones that are cleaner, more efficient. Strange stepped closer, examining the pocket universe with mystical senses. His breath caught. This is remarkable. You've created a reality that operates on simplified axioms. Fewer fundamental forces, more elegant mathematical relationships. Can we use this? Tony asked, hope creeping into his voice. Franklin nodded. I can create a demonstration. A mini Earth 616 that proves a stable configuration is possible. Show Manhattan that we can exist within sustainable parameters. It's risky, Bruce warned. If it fails, we've shown him that we can't solve the equation. And if we don't try, Steve Rogers said from the doorway shield on his arm, despite the fact that no physical weapon could affect this situation. We've already failed. The room fell silent, each person weighing the implications. Finally, Reed nodded. Do it. Create the model. But Franklin, if this doesn't work, if Manhattan interprets this as proof that we're unsustainable, then at least we tried, Dad. At least we didn't just sit here and let the universe end without fighting back. Franklin closed his eyes, and power flowed from him like water from a broken dam. The pocket dimension Strange had created suddenly expanded, filling with detail, with life, with possibility. A miniature Earth appeared rotating slowly. On its surface, civilizations rose and fell in accelerated time. Heroes emerged, fought villains, saved the world. But this time, everything operated within stricter parameters. Probability manipulation had hard limits. Time travel created stable loops instead of cascading paradoxes. Reality warping followed conservation laws. It wasn't as grand as the real Earth 616's. Not as spectacular, not as impossible. But it was sustainable. It could persist indefinitely without collapsing under its own contradictions. It's beautiful, Wanda whispered. It's like seeing what we could have been if we'd been more careful. Reed ran the calculations, checking and rechecking. This works. This actually works. The complexity budget stays within bounds. All the impossible elements are still there, but they're balanced, constrained, made compatible with logical consistency. Tony was already adapting the model, preparing to broadcast it. We show this to Manhattan. Prove that Earth 616 can exist in a stable configuration. Strange raised a hand. Wait. Consider what we're showing him. This is proof that our current configuration is unsustainable, that we need to change to survive. Yes, Reed said quietly. We're admitting he was right. But we're also demonstrating that the solution isn't destruction. It's transformation. And if he decides the easiest transformation is to wipe us out and start over? Natasha asked from the doorway. No one had an answer for that. Franklin looked at the miniature universe floating above his hands, this perfect, sustainable version of everything he loved. We have to believe he'll accept the proof. That logic will recognize a valid solution when presented with one. Reed placed a hand on his son's shoulder. All right. We take the model to him. Strange, can you transport it safely? Strange nodded, weaving protective enchantments around Franklin's creation. The pocket dimension is stable enough. But once we're in Manhattan's presence, his influence may destabilize it. Then we'll have one chance to make our case, Steve said. One chance to prove that Earth 6116 deserves to exist. They gathered their work science magic and cosmic power, woven together into a single demonstration. The greatest minds of a universe collaborating on a proof that their home could survive, if only given the chance to adapt. Outside Manhattan continued his experiments, removing axioms, testing boundaries, searching for the inevitable collapse he believed was coming. Inside, heroes prepared to tell him he was wrong, or at least that there was an alternative. The equation still needed solving. But now, finally, they had something resembling a solution. The only question was whether a being of pure logic would accept evidence that contradicted his initial hypothesis, and whether in the time it took to present their proof, Earth 616 would still exist in a form capable of being saved. They approached at dawn, when Central Park existed in 17 different states of mourning simultaneously. The miniature universe floated between Strange's hands, wrapped in protective enchantments. that barely held against the reality distortion surrounding Manhattan's position. The blue figure stood exactly where they had left him, unchanged, eternal. Around him, the park had become a living equation. Trees that grew in reverse flowers, that bloomed into mathematical proofs, grass, that existed as probability waves until observed. Strange stepped forward first alone. The others waited at the boundary where normal physics still mostly applied. This conversation, he knew, required more than demonstrations of power or clever engineering. It required something humans possessed that Manhattan had long ago discarded. It required the ability to argue for meaning in a universe built on mathematics. Manhattan turned his head with mechanical precision. His gaze settled on Strange, and for a moment, the Sorcerer Supreme felt himself being calculated, reduced to variables, assessed as one might examine a particularly interesting anomaly. "You return with purpose," Manhattan observed. "You have created something." Strange held up the pocket universe, Franklin's creation, glowing softly in the pre-dawn light. "We've created a proof, evidence that Earth's existence can exist within sustainable parameters." Manhattan extended one hand, and the pocket universe drifted toward him, pulled by forces that transcended gravity. He examined it with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything, his perception diving into its structure, analyzing its foundations, testing its logical consistency. Seconds passed. An eternity compressed into silence. "This is well constructed," Manhattan said finally. "The complexity remains bounded. Contradictions are resolved rather than accumulated. It could persist indefinitely without cascading failure." Strange felt hope surge through him. "Then you see, I see that this is not Earth 616. The words fell like stones into still water. Strange stepped closer, careful to remain outside the 15-foot sphere where Manhattan's presence rewrote approach into impossibility. "It's a model, a demonstration of what Earth 616 could become. We're showing you that transformation is possible without destruction. You are showing me that a different universe could exist." Manhattan's expression remained neutral, but something in his tone carried finality. "This proves nothing about whether your current configuration can be saved. Then help us transform it." Strange's voice carried the weight of desperation he could no longer fully conceal. "You have the power to rewrite fundamental constants. Use that power to shift Earth 616 toward this stable configuration instead of dismantling it." Manhattan was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the pocket universe, still floating between them. When he spoke, his words carried something that might have been the distant echo of regret. "You misunderstand my nature. I do not wield power. I observe conditions and verify their sustainability. What you ask requires intent, desire, preference for one outcome over another. I possess none of these qualities." Strange's hands clenched. "You're saying you can see the solution, but won't implement it." "I am saying that implementing solutions is not my function. I measure, I record, I determine what can persist and what cannot. The choice of what to do with that information belongs to others." "Then who?" Strange's voice rose despite his legendary control. "The Living Tribunal withdrew. The cosmic entities are paralyzed by your presence. The one above all remains silent. Who else is there to make that choice?" Manhattan turned to face Strange fully, and for the first time, something almost like recognition flickered in those blue eyes. "You," he said simply. "The choice has always been yours." Strange felt the words like a physical blow. "We can't rewrite the universe on that scale. We don't have the power. Power is not the limiting factor. Understanding is." Manhattan gestured toward the pocket universe. "You created this. You comprehended what stability requires. You identified the necessary transformations. The only question is whether you have the will to enact them." "At what cost?" Strange asked quietly. The things that make Earth 616 unstable, the Infinity Stones, the Phoenix Force, reality warpers like Wanda, they're not just abstract forces. They're woven into people's lives, into the fabric of our existence. You're asking us to unmake ourselves, to save ourselves. I ask nothing. Manhattan's tone remained flat, but his words carried devastating clarity. I merely observe that you face a logical necessity. Persist in instability until collapse, or transform to sustainability at the cost of identity. The mathematics care nothing for sentiment. Strange drew himself up, summoning arguments from depths he'd spent lifetimes cultivating. Then the mathematics are incomplete. You reduce existence to equations, but you miss something fundamental. Life isn't just about persistence. It's about meaning, about the value we create in the time we have. Even if Earth 616 is unstable, even if we're doomed to eventual collapse, the experiences we've had, the connections we've forged, the beauty we've created, those have worth that transcends sustainability. Worth is subjective evaluation, Manhattan replied. It has no bearing on objective reality. Then objective reality is insufficient. Strange's voice rang with passion that bordered on fury. You stand here with all your power, all your understanding, and you're utterly blind to what makes existence meaningful. We don't just exist to persist. We exist to feel, to love, to hope, to create things that matter, even if they're temporary. You've traded everything that makes consciousness valuable for the ability to observe it from outside. Manhattan regarded him with those emotionless eyes. And yet, despite all your feeling and meaning, you face extinction. Your subjective values provide no solution to objective mathematical problems, because the problems themselves are incomplete. Strange stepped forward right to the edge of Manhattan's influence sphere. You see Earth 616 as an equation that doesn't balance, but you're missing variables. Human creativity, the ability to find solutions that pure logic would never predict, the way we make the impossible work through sheer force of will and cooperation. You can't account for those things in your calculations because they don't follow predictable patterns. Randomness cannot solve structural problems. It's not randomness, it's agency. Strange's hands wove patterns in the air, mystical energy forming into shapes that represented concepts rather than spells. Every time you've predicted collapse, we've found a way forward. Every extinction event, every cosmic threat, every impossible situation we've survived because we refuse to accept that mathematics is the final arbiter of existence. We make our own meaning, create our own solutions, rewrite the equations you say are immutable. Manhattan tilted his head, and for the first time, genuine curiosity seemed to flicker across his features. You believe will can override logic. I believe logic is a tool, not a truth. A framework for understanding, not the foundation of existence itself. And I believe that the most important things in any universe, love, courage, sacrifice, hope, those things exist outside your frameworks entirely. Demonstrate this. The challenge hung in the air between them. Strange closed his eyes, reaching deep into the well of power he'd spent decades accumulating. Not the Vishanti's borrowed strength, not the mystic art's formal techniques, but something more personal. The memory of everyone he'd ever saved, every moment where hope had triumphed over impossible odds, every time humanity had proven that meaning could exist in a seemingly meaningless cosmos. He opened his eyes, and the power flowing through him wasn't calculation or force. It was pure, distilled human defiance. We've already demonstrated it, Strange said quietly. We're still here. Despite every logical reason why we shouldn't be, despite all the times we should have fallen to entropy and chaos and mathematical inevitability, we persist. Not because we're sustainable in your terms, but because we refuse to accept sustainability as the only measure of value. Manhattan was silent for a long time. Around them, The park continued its impossible transformations, reality testing itself against boundaries that shouldn't exist. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been the ghost of understanding. Your argument is logically inconsistent. It relies on premises that contradict themselves. It proposes that meaning can exist independent of the systems that generate consciousness. It suggests that temporary existence can have permanent value. Yes, Strange said simply, and yet... Manhattan looked down at the pocket universe, still floating between them. The stable version of Earth 616 that represented everything his logic said was necessary. And yet, you created this. You saw the logical necessity and responded not with denial, but with solution. You accepted the framework of the problem while searching for answers within it, because we're not opposed to logic. We're opposed to the idea that logic is all there is. Manhattan turned away, his gaze sweeping across the fractured park. The confused cosmic entities still hovering in orbit, the universe straining under the weight of his examination. I have observed 17,463 realities at this threshold, he said. 12,809 collapsed. 4,654 survived through external intervention. I told you this. I remember. I did not tell you about the 9 that survived through internal transformation. The ones that recognized their own instability and chose to change themselves before collapse became inevitable. They are the rarest category. The most unlikely outcome. Strange felt his breath catch. Why didn't you mention them before? Because the probability was negligible. 0.00006%. Effectively zero by any reasonable standard. But not actually zero, no. Manhattan turned back to face him, and for the first time since arriving in Earth 616, his expression held something beyond clinical neutrality. Not actually zero. He raised one hand, and the pocket universe expanded no longer. Miniature but full-scale overlaying, Earth 616, like a template showing where transformation would need to occur, what would need to change, what could be preserved. I will not choose for you, Manhattan said. I will not impose this transformation, but I will provide the map, the pathways, the understanding of what must shift for stability to replace chaos. Whether you follow that map, whether you accept the cost of change, whether you value persistence enough to sacrifice the impossible things you've grown accustomed to, that choice belongs to you. Strange stared at the overlay, seeing the massive scope of what would be required. The Infinity Stones would need to be permanently separated, their combined power too, destabilizing for any single universe. The Phoenix Force would need to be redirected to a different cosmic role. Wanda's reality warping would need to be constrained by strict conservation laws. Franklin would need to stop creating pocket universes entirely. Hundreds of other changes, large and small. Each one representing something precious being given up for survival. This will break people's hearts, Strange said quietly. Hearts are not part of the equation. No. Strange agreed, a sad smile touching his lips. They're not. They're part of something much more important. He reached out, letting his consciousness merge with the overlay, seeing all the pathways to stability, understanding for the first time what Manhattan had been trying to show them all along. Not that Earth 616 was doomed, but that it stood at a crossroads. Die as something impossible and magnificent, or live as something sustainable and constrained. We'll need time, Strange said. Time to convince everyone to prepare to grieve for what we're losing, even as we fight to preserve what remains. Manhattan nodded slowly. I will maintain current conditions for 72 hours. After that, the cascading failures will accelerate beyond any possibility of controlled transformation. The choice must be made before that threshold. 3 days to decide whether to save the universe by fundamentally changing what it is. Strange laughed, the sound carrying no humor, no pressure, Pressure is a function of subjective experience, Manhattan observed. Objectively, the timeline is what it is. And you really feel nothing about this? About potentially watching an entire universe die if we can't make the choice in time. Deimagent. Manhattan looked at him for a long moment, and Strange could have sworn something flickered in those blue eyes. Not emotion exactly, but maybe the memory of what emotion had been. I feel nothing, Manhattan said. But I remember feeling, and the memory suggests this would be regrettable. It was the closest thing to empathy he was capable of offering. Strange nodded slowly, accepting it for what it was. Then we won't waste your regret. We'll make the choice, whatever it turns out to be. We'll decide what Earth 616 becomes. He turned to leave, then paused. One more question. Those 9 universes that transformed themselves, did they regret it afterward? Manhattan considered the question with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. Regret requires comparison between what is and what might have been. I cannot measure subjective experience across transformed timelines. But I can tell you this, they continued to exist. They continued to generate consciousness, experience meaning. Whether that meaning was equivalent to what came before, that is not a question logic can answer. Strange nodded. Then I suppose we'll find out for ourselves. He walked back toward the boundary where his companions waited, carrying the weight of a universe's choice on his shoulders, wondering how anyone could possibly make a decision when all the options led to loss. Behind him, Manhattan returned to his observations, patient and eternal, waiting to see what humanity would choose when faced with the oldest question of all: existence or meaning, sustainability or identity, survival or truth. The clock was ticking, and for once, the mathematics alone could not provide the answer. The first 24 hours were spent in debate that threatened to tear the hero community apart. Avengers Tower's main conference hall had never been so crowded. Every available hero, every cosmic entity still capable of communication, every representative of Earth's hidden civilizations, all gathered to hear Strange's report and weigh the impossible choice before them. Tony Stark stood at the podium, holographic displays showing Manhattan's transformation map in brutal detail. Let me be clear about what we're discussing. This isn't a minor adjustment. This is fundamental restructuring of what Earth 616 is. The murmurs that rippled through the crowd carried anger, fear, and desperate hope in equal measure. The Infinity Stones would be permanently separated, Tony continued. No one could ever wield them together again. The Phoenix Force would be redirected to operate exclusively outside our universe. Reality warpers like Wanda would have hard limits imposed. She could still alter probability, but within strict conservation bounds. Time travel would be restricted to stable closed loops only. No more changing the past to alter the present. You're asking us to give up our power, Wanda said quietly from her seat. Her hands trembled slightly, scarlet energy flickering around her fingers. To make ourselves weaker to survive. Not weaker. Reed Richards stepped forward, his expression grave. Constrained. There's a difference. A building with safety limits isn't weaker than one without them. It's sustainable. It can stand for centuries instead of collapsing under its own ambition. Thor's voice boomed across the hall. And what of Asgard? Of the cosmic forces that have governed the 9 realms since the dawn of time, are we to simply accept that our gods must diminish? Strange moved to the center of the room, his cloak of levitation spreading wide. I'm not asking anyone to accept anything yet. I'm presenting the facts. Manhattan has given us 72 hours. In that time, we can choose to transform voluntarily, maintaining some control over the process. Or we can refuse and let the cascading failures run their course. What happens if we refuse? Natasha asked, her voice cutting through the rising arguments. The room fell silent. Strange's expression held the weight of cosmic awareness. Based on Manhattan's observations of 12,000 similar cases, complete reality collapse within 6 to 18 months. Not sudden destruction, gradual degradation. Overlaps spreading until they consume everything. Physical laws becoming so contradictory that matter itself loses coherent form. Consciousness fragmenting across incompatible probability states. Slow death, Steve Rogers said quietly. Inevitable death, Strange corrected. Carol Danvers stood, her binary powers crackling around her. There has to be another option. We've faced impossible odds before. We always find a way. That's the problem, Reed said, pulling up new data. We've found too many ways. Every time we've rewritten reality, every time we've used the Infinity Stones, every temporal manipulation, every probability alteration, they've all left scars on the universe's foundation. Manhattan isn't imposing these changes arbitrarily. He's showing us where we broke ourselves. The second day brought smaller meetings, private conversations, where heroes wrestled with what they'd lose. Peter Parker sat with Wanda in the tower's observation deck, watching the sun set over a city that existed in multiple states simultaneously. I rewrote reality once. Wanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. With 3 words, I changed everything. No more mutants. I tried to fix it later, but the damage was done. And now? She looked at her hands, watching scarlet energy dance between her fingers. Now I'm being told that my very existence contributes to the universe's instability. That's not what they're saying, Peter offered gently. Isn't it? Wanda's laugh was bitter. My power bends probability. That's literally what I do. And probability bending, according to Manhattan's analysis, is one of the primary sources of complexity overflow. If we transform, I'll be limited to minor manipulations. No more reality warping, no more fixing my mistakes. Peter was quiet for a moment. Would you rather keep your full power and watch the universe collapse? I'd rather neither was necessary. Wanda closed her fist, extinguishing the energy. But we don't get that choice, do we? Franklin Richards sat with his father in the Baxter Building's lab, surrounded by equations that describe the transformation in mathematical precision. I'll have to stop creating pocket universes, Franklin said, his young voice trying to sound adult. Every universe I make adds to the complexity, even the helpful ones. Reed placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You've already contributed more than anyone could ask. The model you created gave us this chance, but it means I'll never create another one. Never explore that part of my power again. Franklin looked up at his father, eyes shining with unshed tears. I'm only a kid, Dad. What if this is the most important thing I'll ever be able to do, and I have to give it up before I even really understand it? Reed had no answer that wouldn't be a lie. The third day began with decision time approaching and consensus nowhere in sight. Strange convened the final council at dawn. The group was smaller now, just the core decision-makers, the Avengers, the Fantastic Four representatives from the X-Men, the Illuminati, and mystical entities who had chosen to remain involved. We need a vote, Steve said, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. We need to decide together. How do we vote on something like this? Tony asked. Do we really have the right to fundamentally alter the universe for everyone who lives in it? We have the responsibility, Black Panther said quietly. Whether we wanted it or not. The choice exists. Refusing to choose is itself a choice, one that leads to collapse. Strange stepped into the center of the circle. Before we vote, I need to tell you what Manhattan told me privately after our philosophical debate. He said that of the 9 universes that survived through self-transformation, none of them regretted the choice. They lost things they valued, yes. They grieved for what they gave up. But they continued to exist, to grow, to create new meaning within their new constraints. Easy for him to say, Carol muttered. He doesn't feel loss. No, Strange agreed. But I do. And I'm telling you that I've consulted the Vishanti, reached across dimensional barriers to universes that made similar choices. They all say the same thing: existence adapts. meaning persists. Life finds a way even in diminished circumstances. Reed pulled up the transformation overlay one final time. If we do this, the process will take approximately 17 hours once initiated. Strange will guide the mystical restructuring, redirecting causality vectors along sustainable paths. I'll handle the physical constants, implementing new conservation laws. Franklin will ensure the transformation doesn't destroy existing consciousness. Everyone currently alive will remain alive with memories intact. But changed, Wanda said softly. But alive, Reed countered. The vote was called. One by one, heroes made their choice. Some voted with tears streaming down their faces, others with grim determination. A few with genuine relief that someone had finally found a path forward even if it hurt. When the count was finished, the result was narrow but clear. Transform 53, refuse 47. Steve Rogers closed his eyes for a moment, bearing the weight of what that slim majority meant. Then we proceed. May whatever force watches over us forgive us for what we're about to do. The ritual began at noon, with 6 hours remaining on Manhattan's timeline. Strange stood at the ritual's center, positioned where 11 ley lines intersected beneath Central Park. Around him, mystical practitioners from every tradition formed concentric circles. Wanda channeling chaos magic through rigid mathematical constraints. Dr. Voodoo calling on Loa, who governed transformation. The Ancient One's former students weaving temporal stabilization spells. Magic keeping dimensional barriers intact during the shift. Reed occupied the northern point. His technology interfaced directly with the fundamental quantum substrate of reality. Machines that could measure Planck-scale interactions, manipulate probability fields, adjust universal constants with precision measured in decimal places that stretched beyond normal mathematical notation. Franklin stood at the eastern point, his power focused not on creation, but preservation. He held every conscious mind in Earth 616 within his awareness, simultaneously ensuring that as reality transformed around them, their essential selves remained coherent. Tony Bruce, Hank, and Shuri manned the southern point. Their combined genius maintaining the computational models that predicted cascading effects, preventing transformation in one area from triggering collapse in another. And at the western point, representatives of Earth's cosmic powers. Thor channeling Asgardian magic, Black Panther calling on the Panther God's blessing. Silver Surfer providing feedback from Galactus's cosmic awareness. Manhattan observed from his position, unchanged, eternal. He had expanded his sphere of influence to encompass the entire ritual space, ensuring that the transformation would occur within stable parameters. Strange began the incantation words in languages that predated human civilization, mixed with mathematical proofs that wouldn't be discovered for another 1,000 years. His voice rose and fell in rhythms that matched the heartbeat of reality itself. The transformation started small. In Brooklyn, the Infinity Stone housed in the New York Sanctum began to dim. Its power didn't vanish. It separated, distributing across vast cosmic distances, ensuring no single location could ever wield multiple stones simultaneously again. The Space Stone's consciousness felt something like loss, but also relief. It had never been meant to work in concert with its siblings. Now it could return to its original purpose without the weight of combined omnipotence. In deep space, the Phoenix Force felt the call. It resisted at first, a cosmic entity older than galaxies, reluctant to accept constraint. But Strange's magic wasn't forcing it, merely showing it the path to a new role. The Force could still govern life and death, rebirth and transformation. Just not here. Not in a universe that could no longer sustain its presence without breaking. Slowly, with something that might have been understanding, the Phoenix redirected itself toward other realities that needed its touch. Wanda gasped as her powers contracted. The infinite possibilities she'd once commanded compressed into defined parameters. She could still alter probability, still bend reality in small ways. But the grand sweeps, the reality rewriting declarations, those were gone. She felt the loss like a phantom limb, an emptiness, where unlimited potential had been. But she also felt something else: boundaries. Structure. The ability to use her power without constant fear of losing control. Franklin's pocket universes, the hundreds he'd created over the years, began to fold. Not destroyed, but integrated back into the primary reality. Their useful innovations, preserved their destabilizing contradictions, smoothed away. He felt each one dissolve like saying goodbye to children he'd given birth to. The grief was real and sharp, but beneath it lay understanding. They had served their purpose. Now they could rest. The transformation rippled outward, restructuring fundamental forces. The strong nuclear force no longer varied by quantum state. It settled into a single stable value. Gravity stopped experiencing temporary inversions. Electromagnetic fields propagated in predictable patterns. Entropy returned to unidirectional flow. Across Earth, 116 people felt the change without understanding it. A subtle shift, like reality had been slightly out of focus, and suddenly snapped into clarity. The impossible things they'd grown accustomed to: gravity, sometimes reversing time, occasionally looping spaces larger on the inside than the outside. Those faded into normal behavior. It felt both like losing magic and finding solid ground. The cosmic entities in orbit experienced more profound changes. Galactus's hunger stabilized, losing its reality-warping intensity, but gaining precision. He would still consume, still maintain cosmic balance, but within predictable parameters. The Celestials' evolutionary calculations suddenly resolved their seed patterns, aligning with sustainable timelines. Even the Living Tribunal, watching from beyond dimensional barriers, felt reality restructuring into forms he could properly adjudicate again. 7 hours into the ritual, Reed called out a warning. "We're approaching critical cascade point. If we stop now, the partial transformation will cause worse instabilities than we started with. We're committed." No one suggested stopping. Strange's voice had grown hoarse, but he maintained the incantation, guiding causality vectors along paths that led to stability rather than chaos. His mystical awareness stretched across the entire universe, touching every point where transformation occurred, ensuring that change flowed smoothly rather than shattering. Franklin's young face was pale with strain, but he held firm. Billions of minds depended on him to preserve their continuity through reality's restructuring. He would not fail them. The final hour arrived. Manhattan raised one hand, and the transformation accelerated under his guidance. Not forcing, but optimizing. He showed them where the last contradictions hid, where final adjustments were needed, where one more constraint would ensure permanent stability. Strange saw it all through mystical sight, the universe as a living tapestry, threads of causality weaving into patterns that were less grand than before, but infinitely more sustainable. Earth 616 wouldn't be the reality that defied all logic anymore, but it would be the reality that could exist indefinitely without collapsing under its own impossible weight. At precisely 17 hours and 43 minutes, the transformation completed. The ritual space fell silent. Strange dropped to his knees, exhausted beyond anything he'd experienced. Around him, the other participants collapsed or steadied themselves against whatever was nearby. Reed's instruments showed stable readings across every measured parameter. No overlaps, no probability fluctuations exceeding normal bounds. No cascading failures, just reality. Consistent, predictable, sustainable reality. Franklin opened his eyes and smiled weakly. Everyone's okay. All the minds intact. They remember who they were before, but they're already adapting to who they are now. Manhattan lowered his hand and stepped back, his examination complete. He looked at Strange, and something in his expression might have been approval. "You chose transformation," Manhattan said. "The probability was 0.00006%. You succeeded against improbable odds." Strange managed a tired laugh. We specialize in improbable. So I have observed. Manhattan turned to survey the park, which no longer flickered between states, but existed in single stable configuration. Earth 616 now operates within sustainable parameters. The complexity budget is balanced. Cascading failures have been prevented. At significant cost, Reed said quietly, looking at readouts that showed exactly what they'd given up. All choices have costs, Manhattan observed. But existence continues, and that continuation enables all other values. He began to fade his purpose, complete his observations concluded. Before he vanished entirely, Strange called out, "Will you remember us, this universe that chose to change rather than die?" Manhattan paused halfway between presence and absence. "I remember all observations," he said. "But this one I will reference more than most. You demonstrated something I have rarely seen: the capacity to accept logical necessity while maintaining hope. It is an unusual combination. It's called humanity," Strange said softly. "Yes," Manhattan agreed. "I am beginning to understand what that term encompasses." And then he was gone, returning to whatever realm beings of pure logic inhabited, leaving behind a universe that had fundamentally transformed itself to survive. Strange looked around at his fellow heroes, exhausted, grieving but alive. They had lost something precious. They had gained something essential. They had survived. And sometimes survival was enough. The first morning of the new Earth 616 arrived with unsettling normalcy. The sun rose over New York City at precisely the time astronomical calculations predicted. Gravity pulled with exactly 9.8 meters per second squared. The electromagnetic spectrum behaved according to classical physics. For the first time in decades, reality operated with perfect predictability. It felt wrong. Strange stood on the sanctum's rooftop, watching the dawn. The mystical currents he'd spent his life navigating were still there, but muted, constrained. Like a river that had once flooded wildly, now ran between defined banks. He could still access power from the Vishanti, still cast spells, still protect Earth from mystical threats. But the raw reality-bending potential he'd once commanded had diminished into something more manageable. He wasn't sure if that was victory or defeat. A shimmer in the air announced the Living Tribunal's arrival. The cosmic entity manifested smaller than before, his three faces contemplative rather than judgmental. "The transformation is complete, sure," the tribunal said, and his voice carried neither approval nor condemnation. "Earth 616 now operates within parameters I can properly adjudicate. The logical contradictions that prevented my intervention have been resolved." "Does that please you?" Strange asked. The tribunal's faces rotated slowly, each one considering the question from a different angle. "Pleased is not applicable, but I am functional again. For eons I maintained balance across the omniverse through clear application of cosmic law. Then Manhattan arrived, and I discovered my frameworks were contextual rather than absolute. That knowledge was disturbing. And now I understand that my role is to maintain balance within defined systems, not to claim authority over existence itself. Manhattan taught me humility, however unintentionally." The three faces aligned, speaking in unison. "You made the difficult choice, Sorcerer Supreme. Few universes possess the wisdom to transform themselves before collapse becomes inevitable." Strange looked out over the city, watching people go about their morning routines, most of them unaware that reality had fundamentally restructured around them overnight. "We didn't do it with wisdom. We did it with desperation and a 53-47 vote. Survival rarely requires unanimous agreement, only sufficient consensus." The tribunal began to fade. "I will be watching Stephen Strange, not to judge but to ensure the balance you've created persists. You have earned that much consideration." He vanished, leaving Strange alone with the dawn and his complicated feelings about what they'd sacrificed. In the Triskelion, the Avengers gathered for their first post-transformation meeting. The conference room felt different. Not physically changed, but the atmosphere carried a weight of aftermath. Steve Rogers stood at the head of the table, his uniform showing no wear despite the night's exertions. Reports are coming in from around the world. The transition appears stable. No cascading failures, no reality breakdowns. As far as the general population is concerned, it was a quiet night, because they don't know what they lost, Tony said quietly. His holographic displays showed before and after readings, each one documenting a capability that no longer existed. The Infinity Stones are scattered beyond any possible reunification. Time travel is limited to observation, only no more changing the past. Quantum tunneling occurs within strict probability bounds. We've made the universe smaller. We made it survivable, Natasha corrected. Are those the same thing? Tony's question hung in the air unanswered. Wanda sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. The scarlet energy that usually flickered around her fingers was barely visible now, constrained to microscopic probability adjustments. I tried to alter chance this morning. Just a small thing, making it more likely that my coffee would taste good. The power responded, but it felt like pushing through molasses. Every manipulation now requires justification, conservation, balance. I can't just will things into being anymore. Is that so terrible? Bruce asked gently. Wanda looked at him, her eyes holding complex emotion. I don't know yet. Ask me in a year, or 10. After I've had time to grieve for the godlike power I used to have and learn to appreciate the sustainable power I have now. Thor entered the room late, his expression troubled. I bring word from Asgard. The cosmic trees that connected the 9 realms have stabilized into fixed pathways. No more do they shift with the whims of fate. Heimdall reports that he can still see all things, but the futures he perceives are fewer, more constrained. The web of destiny has defined edges now, Steve said, understanding the implication. My father is not pleased, but he acknowledges the necessity. Thor took his seat heavily. The All-Father says that even gods must accept limits lest they become the very forces of chaos they were meant to oppose. In the Baxter Building, Reed Richards worked alone in his laboratory running calculations that confirmed what his heart already knew. The transformation had succeeded beyond his projections. Earth 616 was stable in ways it had never been before. It was also less than it had been. He pulled up a simulation showing the universe's complexity over time. Before Manhattan, the graph had been exponential, shooting upward toward infinity. Probability manipulation, reality, warping temporal paradoxes. Each one had added layers of impossible complexity, creating a structure too grand to sustain itself. Now the graph was linear, steady, predictable. It could continue indefinitely without collapse, but it would never again reach the heights of impossible majesty it had once achieved. Second-guessing ourselves, Sue Richards entered the lab, her force field shimmering faintly around her. Reed turned from his displays. Just processing. We saved the universe. That should feel triumphant. But it doesn't, Sue finished. She moved to stand beside him, looking at the graphs. We gave up wonder for stability, magic for mathematics, the impossible for the sustainable. Do you think we made the right choice? Sue was quiet for a long moment. I think we made the only choice we could make and still call ourselves heroes. The alternative was letting everyone die to preserve our sense of limitless potential. That's not heroism. That's vanity. Reed nodded slowly. Franklin took it hard. He created one last pocket universe this morning just to say goodbye to the ability. Then he let it dissolve. He's in his room now, and I don't know what to say to comfort him. You tell him the truth, Sue said firmly. That growing up means accepting limits, That wisdom is knowing when to constrain yourself before the universe does it for you. That he contributed something precious by showing us what sustainable existence could look like. She paused. And that his father is proud of him. In orbit, the cosmic entities held their own council. Galactus, the Phoenix Force's echo that remained the Celestials and beings of pure abstraction, discussing their new roles in a transformed universe. Galactus spoke first, his voice resonating across dimensional frequencies. My hunger has changed. I no longer experience the reality-warping consumption that once defined my existence. Instead, I feel purpose, directed intent. I will still consume to maintain cosmic balance, but within predictable cycles. There is something almost peaceful in this constraint. The Phoenix Force's remaining presence flickered. I operate primarily in adjacent realities now, but I can still touch this universe at critical moments. The life-death-rebirth cycle continues, but bounded by conservation of consciousness. I cannot unmake entire species anymore. Perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps I was too powerful before. The Celestials communicated in harmonics beyond verbal language, but their meaning was clear. Their evolutionary experiments would continue, but with defined endpoints. They could still seed life, still guide development, but they could no longer impose contradictory paradigms on the same species simultaneously. Their grand designs had been constrained to actually achievable configurations. It was humbling for entities who had considered themselves beyond such limitations. Silver Surfer floated among them, serving as translator between cosmic awareness and mortal understanding. My master asks if this diminishment troubles you, he said. The beings conferred among themselves. Troubled is insufficient, the Phoenix Force answered. We are adapting, learning to operate within frameworks we did not choose, but have come to recognize as necessary. It is strange to be constrained after eons of unrestricted existence. And yet, one Celestial added their voice, like continents shifting. We persist. That is not nothing. At the edge of perception beyond the boundaries of Earth, Sixfengxing's reconfigured reality, Manhattan observed. He had not truly left. His presence remained reduced to pure observation, watching the aftermath of the transformation he had catalyzed. What he witnessed fascinated him in ways he couldn't fully categorize. The heroes grieved. That was expected loss of capability naturally produced emotional responses, but they also adapted. They found new ways to use their constrained powers. They discovered that limits could inspire creativity rather than simply restricting it. They learned that fighting within rules was different from fighting without them, but not necessarily inferior. Wanda Maximoff, who had once rewritten reality with 3 words, now carefully adjusted probability in microscopic increments. But she did so with precision and intention that her unlimited power had never required. She was becoming a master of small changes rather than a chaos god of large ones. Franklin Richards, forbidden from creating new pocket universes, turned his reality-shaping abilities inward. He began to understand the universe he already lived in, with depth that creation had never taught him. Knowledge replaced power, and perhaps that was its own form of growth. The Avengers, unable to rely on reality-warping solutions to every crisis, developed more sophisticated strategies. They planned better, cooperated more effectively, accepted that some battles would be harder without infinite cosmic power backing them up. Manhattan found this adaptation remarkable. In the 12,000 universes he'd observed collapsing, the inhabitants had clung to their impossible capabilities until the end, refusing transformation even as it killed them. But Earth 616's heroes had chosen differently. They had chosen survival over supremacy, existence over excellence, the sustainable over the spectacular. And they were making it work. Strange stood once more on his rooftop as the sun set, marking the end of the first day in Earth 616's new configuration. The city below him hummed with life, 8 million people going about their routines, most of them unaware that reality had fundamentally changed overnight. But some knew, some felt the difference. A young mutant who had once spontaneously teleported across continents now found their power limited to line-of-sight jumps. They were learning to appreciate the journey rather than just the destination. A sorcerer who had bent dimensional barriers like paper now worked within stricter, mystical frameworks. They were discovering that rules could be elegant rather than restrictive. A scientist who had manipulated probability to guarantee experimental success now had to accept actual failure. They were learning humility. Strange felt the changes in himself too. The temptation to solve every problem with overwhelming magical force was gone, replaced by the need to be strategic, precise, economical with power. It was exhausting in new ways, but it was also sustainable. He could practice magic at this level for centuries without burning out, without breaking reality, without contributing to cascading complexity that would eventually collapse. A presence materialized beside him, not physical, but perceptible. Manhattan's observation focused enough to manifest as awareness. "You're still watching," Strange said. "I observe all outcomes," Manhattan's non-voice replied. "But this outcome holds particular interest. You succeeded where most fail. We gave up everything that made us special. You gave up everything that made you unsustainable. That is different." A pause that might have been calculation. "I have been considering your argument from our philosophical debate. You claim that meaning exists independent of mathematical frameworks. I am beginning to understand what you meant." Strange turned toward the present, surprised. "How so? The universe you have created is objectively less complex than the one that existed before. By pure mathematical analysis, it is diminished. And yet," Manhattan seemed to struggle with concept that defied logical categorization. "The beings within it appear to be generating equivalent amounts of subjective experience, equivalent meaning. They have adapted their expectations to match their new capabilities, and within that context, they continue to thrive. Meaning is relative," Strange said softly. "Yes, I am learning that this is not a weakness of meaning, but a feature. Adaptation is not failure. It is evolution." Strange smiled despite his exhaustion. "Did you learn something from us, Dr. Manhattan?" "I learned that my observations were incomplete. I measured stability and complexity, but I did not account for consciousness's ability to find value in any configuration that permits existence. You showed me a variable I had never properly considered." The presence began to fade. "I will add it to my framework. Future observations will be more accurate because of what Earth 616 demonstrated. Glad we could contribute to cosmic knowledge. Your contribution is noted and appreciated." The presence paused at the edge of perception. "One final observation, the 9 universes. I mentioned the ones that survived through self-transformation. They all report something curious. After the initial grief period, after adaptation completed, they claim to be more satisfied with their constrained existence than they were with unlimited possibility. They say that having everything is less meaningful than having something specific. Why is that curious to you? Because it suggests that limitation is not purely restrictive. It is also defining. And definition, I am learning, is what allows meaning to emerge from the chaos of infinite potential." "Now you're thinking like a human." "Perhaps," Manhattan acknowledged. "Or perhaps I am simply expanding my logical framework to include variables I previously classified as irrelevant. The distinction may be semantic." He faded entirely, leaving Strange alone with the sunset and the transformed universe spreading out below him. The Sorcerer Supreme looked out over Earth 616 smaller, now constrained, limited in ways it had never been before. But also stable, sustainable, capable of existing indefinitely without collapse. They had lost the ability to be gods. They had gained the ability to be themselves, forever. And somewhere in the balance between those two states, in the space between infinite possibility and sustainable reality, humanity would discover what it truly meant to thrive. The first day of the new universe ended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, adapted to new limitations. But tomorrow would come, and that Strange realized was enough. 6 months later, Earth 616 had settled into its new existence with the quiet resignation of a patient accepting a diagnosis they couldn't change. The Baxter Building's top-floor laboratory had become something unprecedented. A fusion workspace where science magic and cosmic understanding converged. Reed Richards stood at one workstation analyzing data patterns that defied conventional physics. Dr. Strange occupied another, translating mystical principles into mathematical frameworks. Franklin Richards sat between them, his evolved perception bridging gaps that neither adult could fully cross. And Silver Surfer Herald of Cosmic Forces provided perspective from beyond mortal limitations. They called it the Sustainability Institute, though Tony Stark had suggested the Department of Making Sure We Don't Break Reality Again. Reed pulled up a holographic display showing 6 months of stability measurements. The transformation is holding better than projected. 0 probability cascades, 0 temporal paradoxes, 0 reality fractures. For the first time in decades, Earth 6116 is operating exactly as the fundamental laws predict, and people are adjusting. Strange added, weaving mystical diagnostics through Reed's scientific data. The collective unconscious has recalibrated. Dreams are less chaotic. Mystical energies flow in predictable cycles. Even chaos magic has found equilibrium within the new constraints. Franklin looked up from his own work, a miniature model of the transformed universe, held in perfect stasis. I've been analyzing Manhattan's methodology. The way he restructured reality wasn't random. It was elegant. Every constraint he imposed served multiple functions. Limiting time travel prevented paradoxes while also reducing entropy accumulation. Separating the Infinity Stones prevented power concentration while balancing cosmic force distribution. He was solving a multivariable optimization problem, Reed said with something approaching admiration. Minimize complexity while maximizing stability, preserve conscious experience while eliminating cascading failures. The mathematics are beautiful. Silver Surfer's chrome form reflected the laboratory's ambient light as he spoke. My master has noted the change. Galactus no longer experiences the reality distortions that once plagued his cosmic awareness. He reports that consuming worlds has become cleaner, more purposeful. The universe's fundamental balance is no longer fighting against itself. Strange walked to the window, looking out over New York. We've been cataloging the changes across all sectors. Mutant powers are more stable, fewer secondary mutations, less risk of catastrophic manifestation. Super soldier serums produce consistent results instead of random variations. Even probability manipulators like Domino report that luck flows more smoothly, like water finding natural channels instead of forcing itself through impossible paths. The universe is healing, Franklin said quietly. Or accepting its scars? Reed corrected gently. We're 6 months into a transformation that fundamentally altered what Earth 616 is. The question isn't whether we're stable. Manhattan's projections confirm that. The question is whether we can build something meaningful within these new limitations. Strange turned from the window. I've been consulting with mystical entities across dimensions. They all report similar observations. Earth 616 feels different now. Less volatile, less magnificent, but also less fragile. We're no longer the universe that defies cosmic law. We're the universe that learned to work within it. Is that better or worse? Franklin asked. No one answered immediately. Finally, Reed spoke. It's different. And difference isn't inherently positive or negative. It simply is. Across the city in a small apartment in Queens, Peter Parker sat at his kitchen table, helping his nephew with homework. The problems were simple. Algebra solve for x. Balance the equations, find the value that made both sides equal. Peter found himself thinking about larger equations. The ones Earth 616 had struggled to balance the variables that had grown too large, the solution that required accepting constraints he'd never imagined needing. His spider sense had changed. It still warned him of danger, but the warnings were clearer now, more precise. Instead of vague tingles suggesting probability clouds of potential threats, he received specific alerts about actual dangers. It was like upgrading from analog to digital, less artistic perhaps, but more functional. He'd saved 17 people last week. In the old universe, with its reality-warping chaos, he might have saved 20. But 3 of those saves would have involved probability manipulation, or last-second temporal adjustments that bent causality past sustainable limits. Now he saved fewer people through impossible means. But the people he saved stayed saved, without creating paradoxes or destabilizing reality further. Was that a fair trade? Peter looked at his nephew, solving equations, finding balance, making both sides equal. Maybe it was. In Westview, Wanda Maximoff tended a garden that grew at normal speed according to natural cycles, without reality warping to accelerate growth or ensure perfect blooms. She knelt in the dirt, pulling weeds by hand, feeling the soil under her fingernails. Her chaos magic flickered at the edges of her awareness, offering to make the work easier to bend probability, so weeds simply didn't grow here. She declined. The work was honest, physical, real in ways that reality manipulation had never been. When she finished weeding this garden, it would stay weeded because she had actually removed the weeds, not because she'd rewritten local causality to make weeds impossible. Vision's memory files sat on her bedside table, preserved, but not resurrected. She had the power to bring him back before to warp reality until he existed again. Now that power was gone, constrained by conservation laws that prohibited creating consciousness from nothing. It hurt. It would always hurt, but the hurt was clean now. No false hope that another reality warp might fix everything. No temptation to break the universe trying to unmake loss. Just grief, honest and human, and ultimately survivable. She stood brushing dirt from her knees and looked at the garden. Imperfect, modest growing at the pace nature intended. It was enough. At the edge of the universe, beyond dimensional barriers, in the space where observation became indistinguishable from existence, Manhattan watched. 6 months of data had confirmed his projections. Earth 616 was stable. The transformation had succeeded. The universe would persist indefinitely without cascading complexity failures. But something unexpected had emerged from the data. The total amount of meaning being generated, measured in emotional bonds, formed creative works, produced problems solved. Lives saved, love expressed, had not decreased proportionally to the reduction in cosmic power. Humans with godlike abilities had generated meaning through their impossible achievements. Humans with constrained abilities were generating equivalent meaning through their careful, deliberate actions within limits. The equation balanced, but not in the way Manhattan had predicted. He had assumed that reducing capability would proportionally reduce value. Instead, he was observing that value was independent of scale. A person saving one life with spider powers operating within natural law generated equal meaning to a person saving 20 lives through probability manipulation that violated causality. The difference was sustainability, not significance. This observation troubled his logical framework in ways he couldn't fully categorize. It suggested that his measurements had been incomplete, that focusing on complexity and stability had missed something fundamental about conscious experience. Perhaps the human's argument had merit after all. Perhaps meaning did exist outside mathematical frameworks, or perhaps he simply needed better mathematics. Manhattan extended his perception across the transformed universe, seeing it whole. Earth 616 spread before him like a living equation. Every component balanced, every interaction sustainable, every consciousness generating experience within predictable parameters. It was smaller than it had been, constrained, limited in ways that the old universe had defied, but it persisted. And in persisting, it allowed something he had not fully appreciated before continuity. The ability for stories to have middles and endings, not just catastrophic conclusions. The capacity for growth over time, rather than explosive expansion followed by collapse. This universe would never again reach the magnificent heights of impossible complexity it had once achieved, but it would exist long enough to achieve other forms of magnificence. Patient ones. Sustainable ones. The kind that emerged from working within rules rather than constantly breaking them. Manhattan found this acceptable, more than acceptable. Interesting. He recorded his final observation of Earth 616's transformation. Subject universe demonstrates successful transition from unstable high-complexity state to stable moderate complexity state. Initial hypothesis that reduced complexity would proportionally reduce value generation has been disproven. Consciousness adapts expectations to match capabilities, maintaining meaning generation across scalar changes. Conclusion meaning is relative to framework, not absolute. Frameworks can change without destroying meaning itself. This represents significant amendment to observation protocols. He paused, then added a note that was unprecedented in his billions of observations. Personal notation. Earth 616 designation, successful transformation case study, insufficient. Recommend designation, example of consciousness. Choosing existence over excellence and discovering that existence contains its own excellence. This universe has demonstrated something I had not properly quantified: the value of choosing to persist, even when persistence requires sacrifice of identity. The mathematics do not fully capture this phenomenon. Further observation of subjective experience variables recommended. Manhattan prepared to withdraw his focused attention to move on to other universes requiring observation. But before he fully disengaged, he manifested one final time in Earth 616's physical space. The Sustainability Institute's members looked up as blue light coalesced in their laboratory. They had learned not to be startled by impossible things, as though this universe offered fewer of them now. "Dr. Manhattan," Strange said, rising from his workstation. "We didn't expect to see you again." "I do not frequently return to observed universes after their outcomes resolve," Manhattan confirmed. "But Earth 616 represents an unusual case. You have generated data that requires me to amend my observation frameworks." Reed stepped forward, scientific curiosity overriding caution. "What kind of data?" "You have demonstrated that meaning persists independent of cosmic scale. That consciousness values sustainable existence over temporary magnificence. That limits can inspire rather than simply restrict." Manhattan's expression, eternally neutral, might have held the ghost of something approaching respect. "These observations contradict several of my foundational assumptions about the relationship between complexity and value." "So we taught you something?" Franklin said, a slight smile touching his young face. "You demonstrated that my education was incomplete. That is not precisely the same as teaching, but the distinction may be semantic." Manhattan looked at each of them in turn. "I will observe other universes differently because of what Earth 616 has shown me. You have altered the framework through which I understand reality itself." "Is that significant for you?" Strange asked. Manhattan considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "I exist to observe and record. When observations require fundamental revision of recording frameworks that represents the highest form of significance I am capable of experiencing." So yes, it is significant. He began to fade, his purpose complete. "Wait," Reed called out. "Before you go, do you have any final assessment? Any wisdom to share about the choice we made?" Manhattan paused at the edge of perception. When he spoke, his words carried finality. Existence is not meant to be infinite. It is meant to be meaningful within limits. You chose limits that permit meaning to persist indefinitely, rather than pursuing infinite meaning that could persist only temporarily. This choice demonstrates wisdom I have rarely observed. And if we had chosen differently, Strange asked, then you would have joined the 12,000 universes that collapsed pursuing transcendence beyond their sustainable parameters. Your choice was statistically improbable but logically sound. That is the most favorable assessment I am capable of providing. He faded completely, leaving only the faint impression of his presence and the understanding that Earth 616 had passed a test most universes failed. Strange, Reed, Franklin, and Silver Surfer stood in silence for a moment. Well, Tony Stark's voice crackled over the laboratory's intercom. Did our blue friend just give us a cosmic participation trophy? Reed smiled despite himself. I think he gave us something better. Confirmation that we made the right choice. Not the easy choice, Strange added. Not the glorious choice, but the right one. Franklin looked at his miniature universe model, the perfect demonstration of sustainable existence. Do you think people will understand years from now? When they've forgotten what the old universe was like, will they appreciate what we gave up to save them? Probably not, Reed said honestly. Most people will never know the universe was different. They'll live their entire lives within these constraints and consider them natural law. Then why did we do it? Franklin asked. Strange placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Because heroes don't save the world for gratitude. We save it because it's worth saving, even when no one notices, even when the cost is everything we thought made us special. Silver Surfer's voice carried the weight of cosmic perspective. My master once told me that true nobility is not found in transcending limitation, but in accepting it with grace. Earth 616 has demonstrated that nobility. Through the laboratory window, the sun set over a transformed New York City. 8 million people went about their evening routines, most of them unaware that 6 months ago, their universe had stood at the brink of collapse and been pulled back by heroes willing to sacrifice divinity for sustainability. The city looked ordinary, normal, constrained by natural law and physical limits. It was beautiful. Reed turned back to his workstation, Strange to his mystical calculations, Franklin to his observations. The work of understanding their new universe continued patient and methodical, built to last rather than built to dazzle. And somewhere beyond perception, Manhattan added one final note to his observations. Earth 6116 has begun its new epoch. Prognosis, indefinite stable existence, assessment, successful transformation, personal notation. I will remember this universe, not because it defied logic, but because it embraced it. Not because it pursued the impossible, but because it accepted the possible and found meaning there. This is rare. This is valuable. This is what consciousness achieves when it chooses wisdom over wonder. He withdrew completely, his attention shifting to other universes, other observations, other equations requiring his unique perspective. Behind him, Earth 616 continued its quiet revolution, learning to thrive not by breaking rules, but by discovering what could be built within them. The universe had grown smaller, and in that smallness found room for everything that truly mattered. Existence was not meant to be infinite. It was meant to be meaningful within limits. And Earth 616, transformed and constrained and beautifully sustainable, was discovering just how much meaning those limits could contain.